Good afternoon, welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, today we have another topic for discussion on modern India. We will talk about revolt of 1857 and its aftermath. We will try to know the causes, its impact, and also the nature of the revolt and the extent to which it spread over the different parts, and what was the strategy adopted by the people who participated in the 1857 movement. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in the studio eminent person, Dr. Manoj Sharma. He teaches history in Delhi University, one of the premier colleges of the Delhi University, Kirori Mal College. So I hope his knowledge and experience will help us to understand this topic in a new perspective. So on behalf, I welcome Dr. Sharma for EduSet lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Hello friends, today we will talk about the revolt of 1857 and its aftermath. The revolt of 1857 was the biggest armed struggle against the colonial rule in the 19th century. The various causes, the economic, social, political, economic, religious, etc. will be discussed in the course of our discussion. At the same time, we will also discuss the nature of the revolt. The nature of the revolt has been contested among various historians. Some of them, they have called it a sepoy mutiny, while others, they consider it as a war of independence. So our attempt would be to study the various causes as well as the nature of the revolt, the various viewpoints, the arguments, the history which has been debated by the various social scientists. At the same time, we would also like to, or we will also discuss the causes for the failure of the revolt, and at the same time we will also talk about the effects of the 1857 revolt, the kind of changes it brought in the administration in India. So the first question which arises is, why did the sepoys revolt? Why there was a need for revolt? And we can very well say the kind of proclamations which we witness during this time, the proclamations in Delhi and at other places which have been given, they say that the immediate cause was that English, they have entertained these evil designs, first to destroy the religion of the whole Hindustan army and then make the people by compulsion Christians. And these ideas gained credence because of official and missionary nexus. So religion was an important factor. The issue of greased cartridges, when the new Enfield rifles, they were being introduced by the British. So the Indian soldiers, they felt that the cartridges of these new rifles, they had to be bitten off by mouth, and it was being rumored that they contain pig and cow fat, which was not acceptable to both the Hindu as well as Muslim soldiers. So religion was one issue, and the policies followed by the British missionaries, Christian missionaries which came to India, was another important factor which caused concern among the people. As I have already suggested that among the military causes, the issue of greased cartridges was an important issue. Another important issue apart from the issue of greased cartridges was the bad treatment which was given to the soldiers. The soldiers, they were maltreated and they were considered inferior by the British. British thought that Indians, they were in no way, in any way, some kind of parity could not be given to the Indians. They were inferior in nature, and in that way they faced a lot of racial discrimination at the hands of the British. This racial discrimination created discontent among the Indian population. They were not happy with the kind of treatment which was given to them. Moreover, when they travelled on behalf of the British to other countries as soldiers, they were refused bhatta. The kind of foreign allowance which was given to them earlier, it was stopped now. They were not being given any kind of foreign allowance. when they were travelling to far-flung areas. It also caused some kind of discontent among the soldiers. In 1856, Lord Canning, who was the Governor General, he passed General Service Enlistment Act, which decreed that all future recruits for the Bengal army would have to give an undertaking to serve anywhere their services might be required by the government. So in this way, the company was forcing the sepoys to work anywhere they wanted them to. So in this way, the soldiers, they were feeling a bit discontented. At the same time, many of the soldiers, those who went abroad, those who crossed the seas, they were not taken back in the fold of the caste. There were some kind of general prevalent beliefs among Hindus that the people, those who travel across the seas, they lose their caste, their religion. So when they came back after their victories or after their wars, then they were not taken back in the caste fold. So this way they were in a way sidelined, which was not liked by them. Another important issue was the political causes. There were various political causes which were responsible for the revolt of 1857. The doctrine of lapse, the annexationist policy of Dalhousie, it invited resentment of native rulers who felt that their existence was endangered, because it stipulated that if there was no natural heir to the throne, then the state could not adopt any of the heirs, and if it was done, then the permission from the the company had to be sought. So the states, they became discontented because such kind of practices were already there in India in various princely states, that when they did not have any kind of natural heir, they adopted heirs so that the continuity in the administration remains. So the doctrine of lapse was seen as lapse of all morals on the part of East India Company, that the East India Company, the morals of the East India Company, they have lapsed, and that is why they have imposed such kind of draconian measures. The right to adoption which was denied to the Indian princes, and the regal titles which were abolished, for example, the pension of Peshwa Bajirao II adopted son Nana Sahib, it was stopped. So the rulers, they had various kind of grievances. The various princely states, they have different kind of grievances against the colonial or British rule. When we are talking about the political causes, we can also point out some of the statements which have been made by some of the British officials, like Sir Charles Napier. He wrote that were I Emperor of India for 12 years, no Indian prince would exist. The Nizam should be no more heard of, Nepal would be ours. So this was the kind of attitude which was there among the various British officials, the kind of annexation they wanted to carry out, their approach in terms of appropriating various Indian princely states. They wanted to appropriate as much as area for themselves. So this attitude did not help their cause, because it alarmed the various princely states, and they had some kind of suspicion regarding the British designs. The policy of Dalhousie, Lord Dalhousie, and the utterances in the writings of these officials, it created some kind of a bad faith, suspicion and uneasiness among the various princely states and the people, those who were living in these states. In 1856, Lord Canning, who succeeded Dalhousie as the Governor General, he announced that the succeeding prince to the Mughal ruler would have to renounce the regal title. Now no longer they will be considered as the emperor, and the ancestral Mughal palaces, the Mughal palaces in which the Mughal rulers they were living, they had to vacate those palaces as well. So this hurt the pride of the people, those who had this kind of faith in the house of Taimur, the Mughal empire, which was seen as some sort of a umbrella organization or umbrella institution which was governing India. and it hurt their pride. Some of the scholars like Subedar and Anderson, they say that the absentee sovereigntyship of British rule was an important political factor. The British, they wanted to be sovereign in India, and at the same time the people, those who were governing the administration of India, they were living in far flung Britain. So that way they wanted to maintain their sovereignty in India. It also hurt in that sense. The continued foreignness of British and draining of Indian wealth also created aversion towards them. When rulers, for example Mughals, etc., those who came from different parts of the world to India, when they came to India, they settled in India, and over a period of time whatever money which they looted, they also invested in India. But it was not happening in the case of British. The British, they remain perpetual foreigners. The money which they could extract from India in terms of revenue or other resources, they were being exported to Britain, and that was some sort of a drain of wealth of the Indian resources. So in this way many Indians, they were being hurt. When we talk about the economic causes, we talk about the British land revenue policy. The land revenue policy, the permanent settlement, the Rayatwari settlement and Mahalwari settlement. All these settlements, they created some kind of discontent among the peasants. Peasants, they had to lose their lands, and they had to also face the oppression of the petty officials, police and law courts. So in this way some kind of a general discontent could be found in the peasants. At the same time we can very well see that the Indians, they were excluded from the well paid higher jobs or higher posts in the administration. The kind of racial policy did not allow the Britishers to assimilate Indians into the higher posts. They were given the lower posts in the administration, and they were not treated at par when they were dealing with the Europeans. They were always lower than the Europeans. Another important economic cause during the revolt which we find was in Awadh. The Talukdars, those who were the landed section in Awadh, they lost all powers and privileges, and they were being dispossessed of their estates. So when they were dispossessed of their estates, they became discontented, and they also supported the rebels when they rose in revolt. But after some time, when British realized that they should be given back their estates, and when they were returned their estates, they again came out of the support which they were giving to the rebels. Now they were no longer supporting the rebels. The artisans and the handicraftsmen, they also suffered as a result of annexation of Indian estates by the company, because what was happening was that the Indian princes, they were giving some kind of patronage to these handicraftsmen and the artisans. They were able to survive because of the patronage or the money which was being provided by these rulers. But because of the decline of the princely estates, because of the decline of the fortunes or the money which was generated in the princely estates, now they did not get any kind of patronage, and which resulted in their impoverishment, and many of them had no option but to go into agriculture, which was already overburdened. So this created a lot of problems. Moreover, the discouragement of Indian handicraftsmen at the cost of the British goods. The Indian handicraftsmen, whatever products they produced, they could not get ready consumers for that, because the cost of the production had increased, and the British products which were machine made, when they were imported in India, they were comparatively cheaper. So in this way the Indian handicraftsmen, they lost. In the economic sense, we can also say that this kind of exploitation was by the triumvirate of Sarkar, Sahukar and Zamindar. Sarkar with its administrative institutions and paraphernalia, Sahukar with his cheating in money lending, and Zamindar with his oppression and rigidity in revenue and rent collection became a menace to peasantry. So all the three institutions of Sarkar, Sahukar and Zamindar, they were bleeding the peasants. In that way they were suffering the oppression at their hands. Moreover, when we see that the people, those who were living in the tribal areas, the tribals, their lands were also encroached upon by the British. British, with their forest policy or the control over the forest resources, they wanted to appropriate as much as forest resources. And when they wanted to appropriate forest resources, the customary rights of the tribal people, those who were living in those tribal areas, they were affected. The tribals whose subsistence was based on these forest lands, they had no other option but to revolt. And that is why during the British rule we find a number of tribal revolts, the most important being the revolt of the Santhals or maybe Chenchus of Hyderabad. Santhals, the two important leaders were Sidhu and Kanu, those who revolted, because the kind of policies, the British forest policy, it affected them directly, their customary rights and their subsistence. When we talk about the other causes, for example, the religious causes, in the religious cause we will talk about the missionaries. The missionaries, they were given a lot of facilities so that they can convert people to Christianity. The sepoys, they were promised promotions if they accepted Christianity. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, he mentions that it has been commonly believed that government appointed missionaries maintained them at their own cost. It was suggested by Syed Ahmad Khan that government was appointing the missionaries and maintaining them at their own cost. The government wanted that people should convert to Christianity, and that is why such kind of promotions, they were being given to them. The soldiers, they were being asked to convert to Christianity, and that is why they were being promoted also. So this kind of religious missionary zeal which was there in the missionaries and the way it was being supported by the government was not liked by many sections of the society, those who were against conversion to Christianity, and they believed that their religion was in danger. Another important religious cause was the Religious Disabilities Act of 1856, which modified Hindu customs. It suggested that a change of religion would not debar a son from the inheritance of property of his father. The Hindu customs, they stipulated that if a son converted to Christianity, then he no longer would inherit his father's property. But the British, they imposed or enacted a new law which suggested that now even if a son converts to Christianity, his property would remain with him. So these were the kind of incentives which the British provided so that people remain within, or the people, those who want to convert, can convert to Christianity. The activities of the Christian padris, and the efforts towards women education, they also made Indians feel that through education the British would conquer them. There was some kind of fear, suspicion in their minds that British, they wanted to control them, they wanted to convert them to Christianity. And various education offices which were set by the British during this time, they were referred by Indians as Shaitani Daftars, a reference that British, they wanted to create some kind of mischief through these daftars or offices. The another important issue was the issue of racialism. In Indians, they were called nigger, sewer or pig. This created a feeling of disgust towards the British rulers, the way they were being treated by the British rulers. The public restaurants and the clubs which were managed by the Europeans, they advertised that dogs and Indians are not allowed. So this kind of discriminatory attitude, this kind of racial discrimination was not tolerated by the Indians, or it was not to be tolerated by the Indians, and many of them, they rose in revolt or supported the people, those who rose in revolt against the British. When we talk about the social causes, we can very well say the interference of the British in the social practices like sati, child marriage, widow remarriage, etc. It led to some kind of discontent among the conservative or the orthodox sections of the society. The orthodox sections of the society, they believed that British should not in any way, in any manner should interfere in the various social practices or rituals of Indian community, and that is why they opposed British. Moreover, the thrust which was given to women's education during this time was also rejected by the orthodox sections. They did not believe that women should be educated, and that is why any kind of measures which British considered to be progressive, they were being rejected by these conservative sections. After talking about these various causes, let us talk about the nature of the revolt. The nature of the revolt has been debated by various historians. The historians, they have different viewpoints regarding the nature of the revolt of 1857. The imperialist school, they say that it was just a sepoy mutiny. Various proponents of the imperialist school like Holmes, Kaye, Roberts, etc., they call it as a sepoy mutiny. John Seeley, he said that it was totally unpatriotic and selfish, with no native leadership and lacking popular support. In a way, the attempt of the imperialist historian is to deny any kind of national uprising in the movement. They say that there was no leadership. The people did not get any kind of proper leadership during this time, and there was no popular support to the revolt. The revolt lacked in any kind of popular support. It was just a sepoy mutiny where the sepoys revolted. But we have many instances of earlier times when sepoys revolted. It was not the first time that the sepoys revolted in 1857. Earlier also sepoys, they had revolted in different parts of the country, but the kind of magnitude, the kind of support which they got from the population during 1857 was unprecedented. This kind of support was not there during the earlier mutinies or earlier revolts, which were very, very local in nature, in which you do not find a lot of support from the masses. T.R. Holmes, he argued that it was a conflict between the civilization and barbarism. So what the imperialist historians, they are doing is that they are calling it as some sort of a conflict between the civilization and some sort of a barbarism which was there in the Indian society. This kind of racial attitude, this kind of approach in which Indians, they were being considered as uncivilized, as barbarians who were to be civilized by the British, it formed the bedrock of the British policy, and this is some kind of a racial approach which was followed by them. The kind of violence which was perpetrated by the British can hardly place them on the side of the civilized. When the British, they say that they were more civilized and the Indians, they were barbarians, then if we see that why this kind of a violence was perpetrated on the Indians when British considered them to be civil, so why they did not behave in a civil fashion. Though they were alarmed by the popular character of the revolt, they insisted on calling it an infection or disease that spread from one area to another. The British, they were alarmed by the popular character of the revolt. Even then they called it just an infection or a disease which was spreading from one area to another. They did not wanted to acknowledge that it was not a sepoy mutiny but much more than that. The British view or the imperialist view has been criticized by some of the Indian historians. Talmiz Khaldun says that British views do not explain the course of the events, rapidity of its widespread nature, and as to why at so many places the people rose in favor of sepoys. The course of the events, the various different events which took place during the revolt in different places of India, then why it spread so fast across India, and why the people, they supported the sepoys in different parts of the world. It has not been studied by the imperialist school, and that is why they are criticizing it as just a sepoy mutiny. Moreover, it is also argued that when it was just a sepoy mutiny or a sepoy revolt, then why the people of India or the citizens, they were being punished. Why British generally punished the people of different parts of India where revolt was more prominent, more successful? Why these people they were being punished, as it has been asked by some of the Indian scholars as well. Sayyid Ahmad Khan, he wrote Asbab-e-Baghawat-e-Hind in 1858. It was the first Indian viewpoint that located 1857 as a Baghawat or a rebellion that critiqued imperialism and its policies in order to explain the causes of the revolt or the rebellion of 1857. So when we are talking about Sayyid Ahmad Khan, it was the first Indian account which is talking about the causes of the revolt and calling it as some sort of a Baghawat, and he is criticizing the kind of policies which were followed by the British, because of which the revolt took place. Another theory which has been put forward is by James Outram and W. Taylor, and they consider it as a result of Hindu-Muslim conspiracy. They don't want to consider it as some sort of a larger perspective. They are just regarding it as some sort of a Hindu-Muslim conspiracy which was hatched by some of the people. It did not have any kind of popular support. In the similar vein, Malleson, he has also argued that revolt occurred as a result of premeditated design at the level of leadership outside and above the sepoy regiments. Malleson is arguing that sepoys did not revolt suddenly, it was not spontaneous in nature. Rather, he is talking in the sense that it was a conspiracy which was decided at an earlier time. The people, those who were involved in the revolt, they decided that they will revolt on that day. It was premeditated in nature, as has been argued by Malleson. Malleson's theory has also been countered by S. N. Sen. S. N. Sen says that revolt was not pre-planned. He says that it had its origin in sepoy discontent and derived its strength from widespread disaffection among civil population. S. N. Sen is arguing that the origin of the revolt can be seen in the discontent of the sepoys, and the strength of the revolt could be seen in the disaffection among the civil population. The civil population was not at all happy the way in which they were being treated by the British, the various kind of policies which were being followed by the British, and they were feeling discontented, and that is why some of the various sections of the society they participated in the revolt. S. N. Sen argues that there was no prior conspiracy except in the limited sense of local patriotism in Awadh. He says that even if you find some kind of a trace of conspiracy, then you have to trace it in the local patriotism of the people of Awadh. Then some of the historians like V.D. Savarkar, Ashok Mehta, etc., they have tried to point out that it was a war of independence. V.D. Savarkar, he described it as a planned war of national independence. He says that it was guided by the nationalist principles of Swaraj and Swadharma. The Indians, they wanted Swaraj or self-rule, and at the same time they wanted to defend their own religion, their dharma. So in this way, Swaraj and Swadharma, they became the important considerations in this war of national independence. Though Savarkar never called it first war of national independence, he called it the war of national independence, but later it was suggested by somebody that he also called it the first war of national independence. Ashok Mehta has also tried to prove that it was national in character. Ashok Mehta has also supported the argument which has been given by Savarkar that the revolt had nationalist or national character. Benjamin Disraeli, who was a contemporary conservative leader in England, he also called it a national rising, that the people of various communities, they participated in the revolt and it was national in character. S. B. Chaudhary has tried to point out the civil and military character of the revolt. He says that it was the rising of the people. Whereas sepoys struck the first blow, they did not produce the leadership necessary to canalize the activities of the rebellious troops. This meant that some civil elements, they assumed the leadership of the movement and used it to their advantage. This toned down the military character of the revolt and saw the merging of military rising into a popular rebellion. So, S.B. Chaudhary is arguing that initially the militant, the element of the sepoys, it was more and more important, but over a period of time the civilian element also became important, and civilians, when they joined it, the military element, it toned down, and the civilians, they in a way participated more in the revolt. The other view which has been given is the view given by M. N. Roy and R. P. Dutt. M. N. Roy saw it as a struggle between the worn out pre-modern feudal class interest and the newly developed commercial capitalism that aimed to achieve political supremacy. On the other hand, in the same vein, R. P. Dutt, he saw it as a major peasant revolt, even though it had been led by the decaying feudal forces fighting to get back their privileges and turn the tide of foreign domination. So, this is some kind of a Marxist viewpoint which has been given by these two scholars, M. N. Roy and R. P. Dutt, who are suggesting that some kind of feudal and pre-feudal, this kind of a feudal and post-feudal elements, they were involved in the revolt. Eric Stokes is another historian who has studied the revolt of 1857, and he has studied it from the point of view of popular participation and subsequently popular protest. He attributes rebellion to the caste mobilization. He considers that caste was an important factor or important constituent in the revolt of 1857. At the same time, he emphasizes on the diversities and the variations in the revolt, that there were a lot of diversities and a number of variations in the revolt of 1857. Later, he modifies his ideas. His ideas does not remain bound by strictly the economic explanations, but also include factors like ecology, culture and mentalities. Another important historian who has talked about revolt is P. C. Joshi. He argues that British policies, they created disaffection and instigated a popular rebellion against its rule. P. C. Joshi says that the systematic exclusion of Indians from official employment of a superior character was an anti-Indian policy which was a national factor of great importance. So, he also argues that British policies, they created some kind of disaffection, and people, they rose in revolt because of these kind of policies which were followed by the British. The way the Indians, they were being excluded from the higher administration, and the way the British, they considered themselves to be superior, this created disaffection among the masses. P. C. Joshi further says that the central aim of revolt was to destroy British rule in India and establish an Indian state in its place. So, when the Indians, they wanted to destroy the British rule and they wanted to establish an Indian empire, so in this way it was a national revolt, the kind of nature which acquired over a period of time. Joshi also maintains that the religious factor, it played an important role but was part of a national factor. Joshi says that the religious factor was important, but at the same time it was also part of the national factor. It could not be seen in terms that it was not a part, or it was apart from the national factor. The Indians, they took up their arms to defend their religion, way of life and nationhood. Religion in that sense was also way of life. In Hinduism, religion today as well is the way of life. So, when their way of life, their subsistence, when their religion itself was in the danger, then they rose in revolt, they rose against the British rule to counter their motives which were ulterior in nature. R.C. Majumdar is another historian who talks about the nature of the revolt. He says that it was not a war of independence. It was not a war of independence, and sepoys were mostly inspired by the desire for material gain than any political or religious consideration. He says that it was not a war of independence, it was neither the first war of independence nor national in character. So he denies the national character to the revolt of 1857. He considers India to be some sort of a geographical expression. He says that the idea of modern nationalism during that time did not exist, and India was just some sort of a geographical expression or geographical entity. He also says that there was a clear Hindu-Muslim diversion. The idea of Hindu-Muslim unity has been preached by different historians or scholars, and they have praised it also. But he says that there was some kind of a diversion, some kind of a diversion between the Hindus and the Muslims, and they were in that way, the way historians they have tried to present Hindu-Muslim unity was not present. It was inherently a Muslim uprising, and Hindus were lukewarm in their response to the revolt of 1857. Then S.N. Sen says that the mutiny became a revolt and it assumed a political character when the mutineers of Meerut placed themselves under the king. S.N. Sen argues that it began as a fight for religion initially, but it ended up as a war of independence, because now the rebels or the people, those who were supporting the rebellion, they wanted to get rid of the alien government, the foreign government, and they wanted to restore the old order of which Mughal emperor was a rightful representative. So in that sense, he argues that the mutiny had a political character, because now they wanted, the mutineers, they were accepting the political authority of the Mughal emperor. They were not in any way deciding to appropriate power for themselves, rather they were accepting the Mughal ruler as their political king or ruler. Some other historians like Kathleen Gough and Percival Spear, they have also studied 1857 revolt, and they have called it as a restorative movement. They say that the goal of 1857 was the complete annihilation and expulsion of the British and reversion of their process of government and agrarian relations. Percival Spear, he has seen it as a last passionate protest of the conservative or the orthodox forces in India against the relentless penetration of the West. These ideas of Percival Spear and Kathleen Gough, they have been rejected by P.C. Joshi, who refutes them and says that during the 1857 uprising, the popular forces were active enough, healthy in their aspirations, and clear-headed in their ideas to prevent a reactionary feudal restoration in India. There would not have been any kind of feudal restoration during this time, and in spite of the British machinations, Hindu-Muslim unity of that time was some kind of a positive achievement as suggested by him. Another historian is Rudrangshu Mukherjee. Rudrangshu Mukherjee, he has argued that soldiers were peasants in uniform, that a large section of the British army consisted of the people, those who came from the peasant background, and they were enrolled as soldiers. So their concerns were, their sensitivities were with the peasants. So in this way, the rebels or the peasant or the soldiers, they were the people, those who were the peasants in uniforms. Their activities had all the characteristics of peasant insurgency in the colonial period. Rudrangshu Mukherjee also argues that ideology played more important role than the narrow economic factors during this time. Mere material circumstances cannot explain our revolt, as those who benefited from the British also joined the revolt. So, in this way he tries to bring the argument of the role of the peasants in the revolt. Another important historian, Bipin Chandra, he argues that sepoys were the peasants in the uniform, and they had their consciousness and their interest was not divorced from the rural population. They identified with the rural cause. Moreover, he says that mutiny in itself was a revolt against the British, because it was a political act. What imparted this character to mutiny was the sepoys' identity of interest with the general population. The way the sepoys or the general population identified with the sepoys and the kind of interaction which took place between them was very important for as factors for the revolt of 1857. Then we will also talk about the subaltern school. Subaltern school, Ranjit Guha is an important historian of the subaltern school, and he gives importance to the role of the peasants and their consciousness, and he underplays other factors. He says that the most important role was of the peasants, but the critics of the subaltern school, they say that the subaltern school overemphasizes the role of the peasants, and when we see the revolt of 1857, the peasants could not develop any alternate perspective of their own. Sumit Sarkar has also argued about the revolt of 1857, and he says that modern Indian history has seen both the elitist and the populist trends, and the revolt of 1857 was also no exception. In 1857 revolt also we find both the populist as well as the elitist trends. We also see a number of recent studies in recent times. A number of historians and social scientists, they have worked on revolt, and now especially after 1990s there is a greater recognition that the rebel sense of space was greater than their village or region, that the rebels, they did not think in terms of only about their region or their areas. Their sense of space was comparatively much more. There was some kind of a communication between different regions, and the free floating rumors, they united them. They were rumors which united the different areas. So the regions, they had some kind of information about each other. Maybe it went in terms of rumors or the way the communication which was taking place between the rebels. The rebels, they shared the rejection of the company's rule. The rebels, they had this kind of unified idea that they wanted to oppose the company's rule because it was affecting their caste and religion, and this effect was defining their entire existence. Their entire existence was based on their caste and their religion. The rebels also wanted to restore a moral order. They wanted that some kind of moral order should come back, and because that moral order had been polluted by an obtrusive and overbearing foreign rule. So these were the kind of ideas which have been recognized in the recent studies. One of the young recent scholars, Sabyasachi Dasgupta, he claims that peasants were no longer peasants in uniform, because uniform itself had transformed sepoys into a new aspiring power elite of Indian society, because uniform gave them some kind of power which they shared with the British. So now they were no longer only peasants, but now they were aspiring for a greater role. The services which they provided to the company over a period of time, it empowered them, and now mutiny was some sort of an opportunity to carve out for themselves an autonomous space, and this autonomous space which they will share with the existing power hierarchy of traditional India. They wanted some kind of share in this existing power hierarchy. He also suggests that their organization was democratic in nature, and if they would have succeeded, then they would not have gone back to the old regime. And he says that in this sense the revolt was progressive in nature. The historians, those who argue that it was regressive in nature, it would have restored the feudal order. So he argues against that, and he says that the revolt would not, the rebels would not have gone back, would not have restored the older order, rather they would have opted for a new order, and that is why revolt was progressive in nature. Another historian is Rajat Ray, who argues that the rebels, they constantly referred to the people of India as Hindu and Musalmans of Hindustan. In it he sees the embryonic ideas of a confederate nation. He says that it signified a confederation of two separate peoples bound together as one political unit by the shared perception of Hindustan as one land. So the kind of proclamations which we see during this time, the proclamations of the rebels, they say that people of India, they were seen as Hindus and Musalmans of Hindustan. So Hindustan as a one political unit, as a confederate nation in which two important communities of Hindus and Muslims, and they were being united, they shared common perception, the common perception of Hindustan. And even before India became independent in 1947, we very well see that the initial films of that time, they were not in Hindi, they were in Hindustani. Hindustani, the language of, the mixed language of Hindi as well as Urdu. So this idea of Hindustan was very well there, which we can very well see in the proclamations which were given by the rebels. Now we will talk about the causes for the failure of the revolt, that why this revolt failed. We can very well see that the revolt was localized in nature, it was restricted, and it was poorly organized. The revolt did not spread to various parts of the country. In some of the parts of the country it spread, and some of the parts of the country they were not affected at all. Many of the armies like Bombay and Madras, they remained loyal to the British, and South India was very little disturbed during this time. Help of the Nepal in the suppression of the revolt proved very helpful to the British. Moreover, Sindhya, Holkar, Nizam, Rajput rulers of Nabha, Patiala, Jind in Punjab, and Maharaja of Kashmir, they helped the British. In this way the revolt was crushed by the help of these rulers. As Canning later said that these rulers, they, or zamindars, those who supported British during this time, they acted as breakwaters in the storm of the revolt of 1857. Moreover, the resources of the British Empire, they were superior to those of the rebels. The Indians, they fought with the swords or the spears, while the British, they were equipped with modern and the latest weapons of the war. They got the modern weapons, and because of which they were more resourceful and more powerful over the Indian rebels. The telegraph lines which were initiated during this time and the introduction of the railways, etc., they informed the commander-in-chief about the movement of the Indian rebels and their strategies, and railways helped in the faster mobilization of the British troops so that they could reach these areas and help in crushing the revolt. At the same time, we can very well see that the rebel units, they did not have any common plans of military action or authoritative heads or centralized leadership. The various leaders of the revolt like Jhansi Ki Rani, Tantia Tope, Nana Sahib, Begum Hazrat Mahal, even Bahadur Shah Zafar, there was not much coordination among them, and there was no centralized leadership also. They were deficient in their experience, organizing ability, and concerted operations. So that way it was some sort of a hindrance in the revolt, and the revolt also lacked a forward looking program, some sort of a coherent ideology, a political perspective, or a vision of the future society and economy. All these things they were lacking during this time, and in some of the areas where rebels they became successful, they did not know what to do next. They did not have any kind of ideology, coherent ideology and a political perspective that what kind of administration which was to be followed now. They did not have these kind of ideas with them. Another cause for the failure of the revolt was that the resources of the East India Company in terms of man and material were much more superior. The East India Company was very fortunate that people of exceptional abilities like Lawrence Brothers, Outram, Havelock, Nicholson, etc., they served the company during this time, and they were able to suppress the revolt because of their ability, and at the same time in the initial stages of the revolt till they received the final reinforcements, they could withstand the pressure of the revolt of the people, those who were supporting the revolt. Now we will talk about the kind of effect of the revolt, the kind of changes which were witnessed during this time after the revolt of 1857. We can very well see that the control of the East India Company over the Indian government was taken off, and now British Crown, it became the paramount power by the proclamation of 1st November 1858, which was known as the Queen's Proclamation. And the Queen's Proclamation, it declared against any desire for extension of territorial possessions and promised to respect the rights, dignity and honor of native princes as their own. Moreover, the Indian loyalists, they served as breakwaters in the storm of 1857, as we have already talked about. So these people, now their support had to be sought by the British, and now the future British policy, they tried to bring them as some sort of a bulwark in their policies, so that they also get support of these people in any kind of future crisis or threat. The proclamation of Queen, it also claimed that, to quote, that our subjects of whatever race and creed be freely and impartially admitted to office in our service, the duties of which may be qualified by their education, ability and integrity duly to discharge. To give expression to this pledge, Indian Civil Service Act of 1861 was passed, but its rules were designed to keep it as a close preserve of the British. So the proclamation is said that no discrimination on the basis of race and creed will be done, and Indian subjects, they will be given a fair chance so that they can also enter the coveted Indian Civil Service. And that is why Indian Civil Service Act of 1861, it was passed. But at the same time, the way its syllabus was framed, the way the examination which was held in London, it was to be kept as some sort of a close preserve of the British, so that Indian should not enter the ranks of the civil services. The Indian Army was reorganized, and it was built on the policy of division and counterpoise. The Army Amalgamation Scheme of 1861, it transferred company's European troops to the service of the Crown. Now the company, the Crown, it wanted that some sort of a different policy in terms of administration of army should be followed, and now the strength of the company's troops, it was increased from the pre-1857 figures of 40,000 to 65,000. Now British, they became afraid, so that they wanted to increase the strength of the British Army, and that is why the strength of the British Army, it was increased from 40,000 to 65,000, and the number of Indian troops, they were reduced from 2,15,000 to 1,40,000 during the same period. At the same time, the proportion in the different armies, it was also revised. The proportion between the Europeans and the Indian troops would be 1/2. For every one European personnel or soldier, there will be 2 Indians in the Bengal army, while for the Madras as well as the Bombay army, it was to be 1:3. For every one European, there was to be 3 Indians in Madras and Bombay army. At the same time, they also wanted to keep the big posts in the army and the artillery department for the Europeans. Indians, they were denied any kind of presence in these departments. The addition of the native element to the legislative councils was also initiated by the Indian Councils Act of 1861, so that now the British, they become acquainted with the sentiments and the feelings of the Indians, so as to avoid any misunderstanding in the future. Now the British, they wanted that some of the native elements, they should also enter the Indian legislative councils, so that opinions of the British, they are known to them, so that any kind of misunderstanding or any kind of crisis could be avoided in future. One of the important effects of the 1857 revolt was the racial bitterness. It was some sort of a worst legacy of the revolt. The agents of imperialism in India remodeled their government on the idea of a master race. The master race was justified by the philosophy of the white man's burden and the civilizing role of British in India. Now the British, again, there was now explicitly they wanted to follow this policy, that it was the white man's burden and British, they were the superior or the master race. If initially they had these kind of ideas in implicit manner, but now these ideas were comparatively much more explicit. Moreover, the policy of divide and rule was now deliberately followed after the revolt of 1857, and it was made the main prop of the British control in India. The divide and rule policy, in which now they did not want that Hindus and Muslims, they should unite in future. So at one point of time they wanted to support the Hindus, and at the other point they wanted to support the Muslims, and they wanted to create this idea that the interests of these communities were not same, rather their interests were different, and these interests were to be solved, or in some measure they were to be solved by the British, and these communities had to seek support of the British in solving their problems. So this was the British sense by which they wanted to follow this kind of divide and rule policy. When we see the revolt of 1857, it gave us some sort of a legacy. The kind of legacy is in the sense of inspiration. It gave us inspiration to fight the colonial masters. After the emergence of Congress in 1885 and the phase of the moderates, extremists and the Gandhian phase, the various phases of the Indian national movement, they sought some kind of inspiration from the revolt of 1857, because when the Indians, they organized themselves in 1857, they can organize themselves now also, and the unfinished agenda of 1857 could be achieved in the due course of time. So it served as some sort of inspiration to the coming generation. When Subhash Chandra Bose, he organized the Indian National Army, the women's regiment was called Rani of Jhansi Regiment. So we can very well see that the kind of language, the kind of personalities, those who were associated with the revolt of 1857, they were being used in 1940s as well. At the same time, we can very well say that the will to defy a mighty colonial empire was reflected in the 1857 revolt. Though it had a number of deficiencies, they were not organized in that fashion, but even then the kind of will, the kind of strength they reflected during that time, it was some sort of an inspiration for the future generations. So on their march to Imphal in 1944, at the tomb of Bahadur Shah Zafar in Rangoon, the soldiers of the Indian National Army, they took a solemn oath to free their motherland. The road to Delhi is the road to freedom. On to Delhi, said Netaji, so that the historic injustice of 1857 could be rectified now. The 1857 revolt, the various resonances can be seen in some of the films as well. In 1953, Jhansi Ki Rani was made by Sohrab Modi, who presented Queen of Jhansi as one of the key figures of the revolt of 1857, and how she fought for her rights and for her Watan. Two other films which were made later in 1970s were Shatranj Ki Khiladi by Satyajit Ray and Junoon, which was made in 1978. And these two films also had some kind of reflection of the events of 1857. Mangal Pandey, which was made in 2005, was another film which portrayed the role of an Indian soldier in initiating the 1857 uprising. We can say that films are capable of dealing with the past and holding a large audience. Roshana Majumdar and Deepesh Chakravarti, they argued that films like Mangal Pandey can bridge that hiatus between elite conception and mass consumption of history, and thus contribute towards the development of a democratic culture and policies in India, because films are seen by a larger audience, and when these larger audience, so we might have some kind of fiction in the films as well, but audience, they become educated because of the portrayals in the films. To conclude, in retrospect, we can very well say that 1857 uprising has many histories, and these histories are reconstructed, reinvented, rewritten, reimagined, remembered, memorialized in different times. There is not one authentic account of these events. The causes, the nature and the aftermath have contestations at all levels and at all times. Thank you.
Okay. So every students need to have a relook on these facts and figures, and accordingly they can reconstruct the history or the story of the 1857. What you suggest to the students?
As it is happening now also, because after 2007, when we had 150 years of the revolt of 1857, many a large number of books, a lot of material on 1857 have come up, so that we can also see the new kind of sources and rewrite history in a new fashion or new terms.
Okay, so that is true, but so what caution one need to have in the minds while constructing the story?
Largely the history of 1857 has been written because of the based on the archival sources, and most of the works, they were of the British. Not much Indian accounts were available in writing the 1857 revolt. But now the newer histories, which are focusing on the oral history as well, they are writing their history on the basis of the various songs, the local literature, the events which were written in the diaries of the people, those who were of that time. So these kind of accounts, which were not official in nature, the oral history in terms of songs, or the stories which came down in terms of oral memories. So in that way the history has been written, but we should also be cautious in writing these kind of histories, that we should try to corroborate them if possible. But at the same time, we can very well say that these kind of histories will enrich our experience of the 1857 revolt, as we have seen in the recent writings.
Okay. So, well friends, with these words we conclude the lecture, and I would like to tell you that tomorrow we will have another landmark event of the modern India, and we will discuss in details. So, with this I thank all of you for watching the lecture, and on behalf I thank Manoj Sharma ji for giving such a wonderful lecture. Thank you very much.